مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. من أشهر ما جاء في الإنجيل ما كتبه سانت بول قائلا: حب المال هو أصل الشرور. منذ ذلك الوقت على الأقل وضحت الصلة بين المال والشر، وكما نعرف شكلت اللهفة على المال أو الطمع الحافز وراء جرائم مروعة، ولكن المال أيضا أداة مهدت الطريق لجرائم أكبر، وإيقاف تدفق المال ربما يكون الطريقة لمنع بعض المجرمين من ارتكاب جرائمهم الفظيعة. في الأعوام الأخيرة صار إيقاف تدفق المال أحد أهم الاستراتيجيات وأكثرها نجاحا في المعركة الدائرة ضد الإرهاب. وفي هذه المعركة من هم على الخطوط الأمامية ليسوا جنودا مسلحين بأحدث الأسلحة، وإنما مهمون ومحاسبون ومحللون استخباراتيون مسلحون بأحدث التقنيات. إن نجحوا فقد تستمر رغبة الحربيين المغمومة في شن هجمات مروعة، ولكن سينكسهم المال اللازم لتجنيد الأفراد ووضع الخطط وتنفيذها. لمناقشة الجهود الأمريكية والدولية لقطع الإمدادات المالية عن الإرهابيين، يسرني أن أرحب بدانيال غليزر المساعد السابق لوزير الخزانة. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today we're going to talk about the financing of international terrorism and what the United States and its partners are doing to stop it. Our guest today is Daniel Glazer. Welcome very much to Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you for having me here. It's a great honor.
So let's start at the beginning. How do terrorists get their money? And if we're talking about, say, the terrorist groups that are on the minds of many people in the Middle East, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, Daesh, how much money are we talking about?
Well, there's not an easy, quick answer to that question. It really depends on the terrorist organization. You have your sort of quote-unquote classic terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, which subsists mainly on foreign donations. Donations coming from rich donors in various different countries around the world, often transmitted through charities, often transmitted through couriers, often transmitted under the cover of a variety of legitimate activities. And that's how Al-Qaeda makes their money. A group like Hezbollah makes their money primarily from Iran. Iran provides the vast majority of funding for Hezbollah, but in addition to that, they have a global network of commercial and financial relationships and a variety of illicit activity that they engage in to allow them to make money. And then the most challenging for the United States has been the Islamic State. What makes them unique is not only that they are so wealthy, but that they derive so much of that wealth internally from oil sales and from exploiting the territory that they control. That has forced the United States to drastically change the way it thinks about terrorist financing and the way it approaches terrorist financing with respect to the Islamic State. As far as numbers go, it's always hard to measure these things. When you're talking about groups like the Islamic State that control territory, that have industries like gas and oil production, that can tax population, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue annually at their height. I think that that's obviously reducing now as the United States and its allies make progress in defeating them on the ground. When you have a group like, again, Hezbollah that relies on a state sponsor like Iran, you are also talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. The numbers with respect to Al-Qaeda that rely more on foreign donations are a little bit smaller, and there's not an internal treasury the way there would be for a group like the Islamic State, but the numbers are still pretty frighteningly large.
So those are the numbers on the revenue side. I remember in the days after September 11th, there was so much talk about how little money it took to fund a horribly spectacular terrorist attack. Is it still a relatively small amount of money for something like a Nice attack or a Paris attack?
You know, the problem with those numbers, and people, you hear those numbers all the time, that to conduct a catastrophic terrorist attack or even a smaller terrorist attack, it only costs a few $1,000s, and the people will wind up adding, well, this is the price of the car that they use, and this is the price of the airline ticket, and this is the price of the weaponry, of the explosives, and you come up with just a few $1,000s. The problem with those numbers is that they're only really looking at the final stages of the terrorist attack. An individual terrorist attack is relatively inexpensive. What's expensive is operating a global terrorist organization. For a terrorist organization to be able to project power, for a terrorist organization to be able to have worldwide logistics, for a terrorist organization to be able to radicalize populations, for a terrorist organization to be able to centrally control operations throughout the world. That's not an easy thing, and that's not an inexpensive thing. That's actually quite expensive. So what we tried to do, certainly when I was in the government, and I'm sure the United States government is continuing to try to do, is precisely that, is to smash the middle, is to make it impossible for a global terrorist organization to actually operate globally, to make it very difficult for it to maintain its tentacles around the world on an ongoing basis. And then the challenge that governments face, and that I think the United States and its allies face, are the lone wolf attacks. And those, yes, those are much harder to detect and to prevent and to target. Those become more of a law enforcement issue than a sort of a strategic, a strategic terrorist financing issue. But that's, in fact, what always the plan was, to try to drive them towards more local, less ability to act catastrophically.
So you mentioned a few moments ago something that to my ears is still very scary, the idea that states are providing funding to terrorist groups. You referred specifically to Iran and Hezbollah. There was talk in previous years of certain Gulf states having semi-official money, or leaders of various Gulf states winking and nodding at money going to terrorist groups. Has that problem been solved in your view?
I think the Gulf states have made tremendous progress over the last 10 or 15 years, certainly since 9/11, in the seriousness with which they take terrorist financing and the actions they take to combat terrorist financing. I think Saudi Arabia is a perfect example of a country that had previously been more of a permissive environment for terrorist financing. If you look back into some of the statements that came out of the Treasury Department during in the middle of the Bush administration, identifying Saudi Arabia as an area of great concern. The Saudis have taken those concerns quite seriously, and you've seen a real transformation within Saudi Arabia. And I feel very comfortable saying at this point that Saudi is one of the United States' closest partners in combating terrorist financing. That's not to say there's no terrorist financing that goes on in Saudi Arabia. There certainly is. But I think the most we can ask for as the United States is to have good partners and friends in these governments who are willing to work with us and who are willing to turn their financial systems in their countries into a hostile environment for that conduct. And I think that we have achieved that, in fact, in Saudi Arabia.
Just in terms of Iran for a moment, there was a great concern here in the United States when the Iran nuclear agreement was approved that increased funding to Iran, or Iran's increased access to funds, would make its way to Hezbollah, that there'd be more money available, that sort of thing. Has the evidence borne that out? Is it too early to tell? What do you think?
Well, even at the height of the financial pressure we were able to bring to bear against Iran, Iran always had enough money to spare for Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has received consistently hundreds of millions of dollars from Iran throughout this time period, and they continue to receive it. Iran has been and remains the world's chief state sponsor of terrorism, and that hasn't changed. I think the Obama administration was quite explicit that even in signing the nuclear deal with the Iranians, it was very cognizant and aware that Iran did continue to play this role and was going to continue to go after that. President Obama signed some very important Hezbollah sanctions legislation that was passed by the Congress a couple of years ago that has been put to very good use. I think the strategy that we implemented at the Treasury Department and throughout the U.S. government to target Hezbollah financing in Lebanon and around the world has been quite effective. The fact of the matter is, though, that as long as Iran exists as a state sponsor of terrorism and continues to provide this money to Hezbollah, Hezbollah will continue to have quite a bit of resources.
So let me ask you a sort of conventional Washington question. What don't we know? What do you worry about in terms of the flows of money to terrorists? And later on the show, I'm going to ask you about what we're doing to stop the flows. But in terms of just the intelligence about the flows to terrorism, what do you think we don't know enough about?
Well, it's hard to say. You know, again, to quote a famous Washington politician, we don't know what we don't know. We are very good. Our intelligence agencies are very good, and our intelligence agencies are constantly looking for the donors and looking for the financial channels that terrorist organizations use. But the fact is that the people in these organizations are very smart and very clever themselves. They understand how to engage in anonymous transactions and engage in transactions that are difficult to identify. There's all sorts of ways to use the informal financial system that make it very difficult to track money and to find who's conducting these transactions. So it's painstaking work, and it's not. There's not a specific thing that I worry we don't know. I just know that there's a lot of conduct going on out there that is very hard for us to find, and we are looking for it, and we're constantly looking for it, and when we find it, we do something about it. But there's certainly a cat and mouse element to this game, and it's something that we just need to continue to plug away at.
Okay, when we come back with Daniel Glazer, we're going to discuss what the United States is doing to stop this flow of money in just a moment. My guest today is Daniel Glazer. Daniel is finally exhaling after serving for nearly 6 years as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing in the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, just retiring in January 2017. In that position, he was responsible for helping to formulate and coordinate counter-terrorist financing and anti-money laundering policies for the Department of the Treasury. Previously, he served as the first Director of Treasury's Executive Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and as an attorney for the United States Secret Service. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and his law degree from Columbia University in New York. So now, after having spoken about the problems, let's talk about some of the solutions. So what would you say are the main tools and the main strategies for cutting off this flow of money to the major terrorist groups we've just discussed?
Well, sure. Again, I think you, at the end of the day, have to go terrorist group by terrorist group because it varies. As we said before, a group like the Islamic State, which derives so much of their funds internally, the same strategies can't be used with respect to them as is used with respect to a group like Al-Qaeda, which does rely on foreign donors and charities and things like that. The sad truth is, with respect to the Islamic State, so much of the solution has been military. I used to joke when I was in the Treasury Department that things are bad when the Treasury Department's #1 recommendation is drop more bombs, but that's really where we were for a couple of years. And it was pretty interesting to have the Treasury Department working so closely, hand in glove, with the military and with the Defense Department to identify key cash storage sites, to strike militarily.
Actually blowing up ISIS cash.
Millions of dollars of ISIS cash blown up. To identify the key oil facilities and gas facilities and refining facilities and blow them up. To identify the transportation mechanisms, the trucks that were used to transport the cash, and again, and blow them up. This is unconventional work for the Treasury Department, but it's something that we very much found ourselves getting into. The interesting thing with respect, and so ultimately, what's going to deprive the Islamic State of their access to revenue will be the ongoing shrinking of the territory that they control. That said, the work that we do to cut them off from the international financial system remains quite important, precisely because We don't want them to be able to take the money they have and send it out to support operations elsewhere, to support networks that they may have elsewhere, or to just stash it away for such a time as that they don't have their safe haven in Iraq and Syria. So there still is a tremendous amount of work, and I think it's some of the more interesting work that the Treasury Department has been doing recently to identify their financial networks that originate in Iraq and that originate in Syria, but have tentacles throughout the region and on into the rest of the world, and cut those off. Exchange houses, money transmitters, primarily exchange houses and money transmitters, and figure out how they're using them and try to cut those off. With respect to a group like Al-Qaeda and many other terrorist organizations, the work is to work with the intelligence community, find the donors, find the networks, and then work with governments, whether it's the Saudi government or the Qatari government or the Kuwaiti government or the Turkish government or the Jordanian government, and figure out things that we can do along with them to cut off the financial mechanisms that are used, whether it's exchange houses, whether it's banks, whether it's cash couriers, to go after the various forms of financial transmission that the terrorist organizations use.
So today, with all the effort that you've focused on cutting terrorist groups off from the international banking system, do you feel as though you've been successful? Is it now that terrorists are forced to use informal systems and they really have very little access to banks? Or are there still banks out there, old-fashioned banks, that terrorists still use?
There's only a finite number of ways you can transmit money in this world. There's infinite varieties within those categories, but there's really only a finite number of categories. You have banks, you have non-bank financial institutions, you have trade, and you have the movement, direct movement of cash or commodities. Well, that's trade. So you have the direct movement of cash, you have trade, you have non-bank financial institutions, and you have banks. There's only four methods conceivable of transferring value in the world. And we have to focus on all four of them, because all four of them remain available to terrorist organizations, including banks. That said, the goal has always been to make it costlier, riskier, less efficient for terrorists to move money. We have certainly done that across those categories, including in banks. There was a time, really not too long ago, where in many parts of the world, and even if you go back a number of decades, even in the United States, where it was very easy to walk into a bank with cash, no questions asked, and have your money transferred. That world doesn't exist anymore. The system of controls that have been placed in financial institutions, not just banks, throughout the world, have made it costlier, riskier, less efficient for terrorists to move their money. That said, they still find ways to do it, and that's why we still need to be on the game.
So let me ask you about how our bureaucracy works in terms of this. Historically, it's a bit odd to imagine the Treasury Department sitting at the same seat in the counterterrorism discussions of the United States. But now, is that the case? Does Treasury have a full seat at the table in fighting international terrorism?
Yes, it was really cool, because I was there for that evolution at the Treasury Department. I was there in 2003 and 2004 when we built a national security office at the Treasury Department, when the idea first arose after most of Treasury's enforcement authorities were transferred to the newly created Department of Homeland Security, and there were a few of us retained at Treasury. People like myself and Juan Zarate and Stuart Levy and several others who were given the task of saying, if we could build an office within the Treasury Department that brings together all of Treasury's expertise, all of its authorities, all of its information, all of its contacts and connections, both formal and informal, throughout the world, with the idea of devising and implementing strategies to advance national security, to advance international security, to advance U.S. foreign policy, we could create a whole new approach. And it worked. We wound up putting financial pressure on actors that it had previously been assumed were untouchable, whether it's Iran or whether it's North Korea or whether it's terrorist organizations like the Islamic State or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda. We came up with tools and approaches that allowed us to put financial pressure on groups that thought that the United States could not reach out and touch them in their home base, and we proved them wrong. And as a result of that, we do have a seat at the table.
So we only have a few seconds left. If you could fix or repair or improve something, take it to the next step, what would that be?
Oh, I really have to get used to not being in the United States government because I'm always very careful about those types of questions. You know, it's really, I think we're on the right track. I think if I were to give advice to the new administration, it would be to continue on the road that we're on with respect to the Treasury Department. That the Treasury Department really has come up with a new set of tools for the United States government to use, and they've allowed us to be so much more effective than we ever had been before. And I think it's important that we maintain that, and I think it's important that we continue with that, and I think it's important that be continued to give emphasis, and I hope the new administration does that.
Okay, Daniel Glazer, thank you very much for
Thanks
joining
for
us
having me. I
on Dakhel,
appreciate it.
Washington. Excellent. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول خطر الإرهاب في بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.